Or somebody has an axe or a saw. So it goes.
There is a step to the side.
There is a step. Okay. Oh, I see. Yes. All right. Well, I think I can stand on my tiptoes and read my notes. It's a pleasure to be here. Glenn+Jonas is chairman of the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Campbell, where students have honored him with several teaching honors. No surprise. He is a graduate of Mars Hill College, Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and Baylor University. Dr. Jonas has published a critical evaluation of Albert Henry Newman, church historian. He has co-authored A Journey of Faith, Introduction to Christianity, and Christianity, a Biblical, Historical, and Theological Guide for Students. He has presented papers at numerous professional meetings and has published articles in a variety of academic journals. His most recent publication is Nurturing the Vision, First Baptist Church Raleigh. It is the basis for his presentation this evening. I am happy to announce this evening that that the Society has voted to recognize his superb service to us as a society for many years by presenting him with a lifetime membership. So congratulations for that. I am proud to have the privilege this evening also of introducing my former student and good friend, Glenn+Jonas. Glenn, come, we look forward to you.
It means a lot when, I need to turn my microphone on. There. It means a lot when your former professor introduces you. And so thank you so much, Dr. Pitts. And thank you all for being here tonight and for your interest in Baptist history and for your interest in this wonderful church, this wonderful congregation that I have actually absolutely fallen in love with over the last 4 years. We have obviously the current pastor of the church here tonight. I see Dan Day, Chris's immediate predecessor, who is sitting right back here, former pastor of the church. And then Bill Tuck is sitting here. Bill was the interim in between Dan and Chris, and it's good to see you tonight as well. So there's the former pastors here. As I came in a little while ago, Bruce and Chris asked me, do you want to speak from down there or from up here? And I said, I want to speak from up here because I know the names of people through the centuries that have spoken from here. And some great names have stood in this very spot. And so as a historian, this spot is important and meaningful, and I wanted to speak to you from this spot. Back in 1917, one of the more famous episodes, back in 1917, William Jennings Bryan spoke from this very spot. The church allowed the sanctuary to be used by the local anti-saloon league. And they invited William Jennings Bryan to come over and to speak to the anti-saloon league. And according to the write-up in the Raleigh newspaper from that event, Bryan had to be stopped on several different occasions, once by the pastor of the church, Thomas W. O'Kelly was his name, because the crowd had become so boisterous that the crowd had actually violated the agreement that the Anti-Saloon League had signed with the church, that they would maintain a proper decorum here in the sanctuary. And part of that agreement included no applause or no clapping in the sanctuary. And so Brother Bryan had to tone it down a little bit during that meeting. But that's one of the more interesting speakers that's been in this spot. Speaking of the value of writing local church history, Buddy Sheridan has said, In the future, Baptist historians probably should spend far more time on local than global history. The latter is almost impossible to do correctly, but the former is manageable, so helpful, and serves to correct our generalizations about our spiritual family. Writing local church history can be rewarding for a congregation. It allows the congregation to see and understand better its historical context. It can shed light on the roots of certain controversies or the seeds planted that may be reaped many years later with positive results. A church's history also provides a witness for the local community to the grace of God both during good times and bad. Working through the history of First Baptist Church Raleigh has been a historian's dream. I say this because of the archival resources made available to me as I began the project. As early as 1886, the deacons gave attention to the church's records with a recommendation, quote, that a person be employed to transcribe all the church records extant, unquote. 3 years later, the church purchased a safe to provide protection for the records. But the true credit for the excellent condition of the church records rests upon a couple, Thornton and Fannie Memory Mitchell. Thornton was the state archivist for the state of North Carolina from 1973 to 1981. Years ago, he and Fannie Memory began to organize the church's records. Following his death in 2003, Fannie Memory and the History Committee of the church carried the project to completion, resulting in what arguably could be the best local church archive collection in the state. Records of all church conference meetings exist, with the exception of only a few years in the 1830s and a few months scattered through the church's 2 centuries. All of these church conference records have been both microfilmed and digitized. In fact, I had a copy of all of the church records on my laptop as I worked through these records. So they've been microfilm digitized. There's also a good collection of deacons' meeting minutes, WU minutes, Sunday school records, weekly bulletins, newsletters, photographs, and scrapbooks, along with miscellaneous records from important committee work through the years. All of these resources have been carefully organized and protected in a safe location here in the church. This evening, I want to take us on a journey through this church's 2 centuries by tracing 2 important aspects of its history. Number 1, the relationship between the black and white members. And number 2, the role of women in the life of this church. First of all, the relationship between the black and white members. On 7 March 1812, 23 people, 14 of African descent and 9 of Anglo descent, were dismissed from the Cool Spring Baptist Church located several miles outside the city of Raleigh where they had been members. The following day, these 23 people, quote, being thought orthodox, were regularly constituted into a Baptist church, unquote. Hardy Sanders and John Briggs, both white, were ordained as the first deacons, and the church took the name the Raleigh Baptist Church, which remained its name until after the Civil War, on up in the late 1800s. It was changed to the First Baptist Church Raleigh. Elhanan Nutt, I love that name, Elhanan Nutt, who was also white, was chosen to serve as the first church clerk. While the church included both black and white members from its inception, very little mention is made of the black members in the early minutes of the church, except in the member lists. On several occasions in the early decades of the church, the names of members, their dates of baptism or affiliation, and their death dates were kept. The lists were usually divided into 4 categories: white male members, white female members, black male members, and black female members. The black members' names were usually listed by first name only, and then if they were slaves, their owners' names were listed beside them in parentheses. On 25 January 1823, the church appointed a committee composed of the pastor, Robert T. Daniel, and 2 other laymen to, quote, confer with the colored brethren of this church on the propriety of establishing certain rules and regulations for their future government, unquote. The following week, the committee made its report to the church. Included in the report was a suggestion for a standing committee composed of Brethren Hendon, Turner, and Lightfoot to examine the Christian experience of the black brethren who seek membership in the church, as well as to hear appeals for restoration in situations of church discipline. Finally, the report recommended that a deacon be appointed among the black brethren for the purpose of administering communion. Brother Joseph, a slave who belonged to Raleigh plantation owner Sherwood Haywood, was chosen for the task. The report concluded that, quote, if any black preacher of our persuasion who shall be in possession of ample credentials wishes to preach in this place, that he have liberty of the meeting house, provided it not be occupied by the whites, unquote. One of the more inspiring slave stories from the antebellum era in Raleigh involves a slave named Lunsford Lane, and the Raleigh Baptist Church may have played a small role in the story. Lunsford Lane was born in 1803 into slavery on the Sherwood Haywood estate in Wake County. He became an astute businessman and possessed a remarkable entrepreneurial spirit. His benevolent owner allowed him to earn money through extra work, and with help from his father, he developed a particular blend of smoking tobacco for which local demand soon developed. Lane ultimately accumulated enough money to purchase his own freedom and move to the north. There he continued his business and amassed enough money to return to Raleigh, where he sought to purchase freedom for his wife and children. When he returned to the city, a local mob of whites, angry about his success, abducted him, and they were carrying him off to lynch him when some cooler heads prevailed, and they ended up, however, tarring and feathering Lunsford Lane. With the aid of benevolent whites, however, Lane and his family boarded a train for Philadelphia and left the city of Raleigh for good. He spent the rest of his life in the North as an active leader in the anti-slavery movement. Although the exact date of his death is not known, most sources indicate that it was probably somewhere after the end of the Civil War. Along with other prominent Raleigh residents, Lane, in his autobiography, includes Amos J. Battle, the church's pastor from 1839 to 1841, and Thomas Meredith, a member of the church and founding editor of the Biblical Recorder, as his supporters. Also, the evidence suggests that Lane was a member at one time of this congregation. In his autobiography, he relates that, quote, he had been baptized and received into fellowship with the Baptist denomination, unquote. Given that the Raleigh Baptist Church was the only Baptist church in the city at the time, it would be safe to conclude that he was a member of this church. That may also be confirmed by the church records. The name Lunsford Haywood appears in one of the black members lists in Volume 1 of the church records, joining sometime around 1828 by baptism. The lack of the surname Lane is not unusual, given that the slaves were often listed by their first name only and frequently identified by the surnames of their owners. As might be expected, the records from the decade preceding the Civil War reveal a growing distance between white and black members. On 5 September 1856, the church determined that the black members would have to be moved out of the galleries so that the children and young persons of both sexes connected with the Sabbath school would have a place to participate in the Sunday morning services. A further note indicated the church's support for the colored congregation to have a special service every Sabbath afternoon and permission to use the galleries at night. An interesting addition to the church minutes in early 1861, just before the beginning of the Civil War, records that a voluntary committee of 12 white members was appointed, quote, to attend to the colored brethren, unquote, for the next 3 months. No reason is given for that committee, but it could serve as a clue that the two groups were growing apart, and it may be evidence of tension that began to exist in the minds of Southern whites regarding the slaves on the eve of the Civil War. An important step in the eventual split between the black and white members came in 1865 following the conclusion of the Civil War. A report from late 1865 revealed that the black members of the church wanted to begin their own Sunday school program. Believing that they had come to the church, quote, in the right spirit, unquote, J.C. Markham offered a motion to approve their request and give them all the aid we can. After considerable discussion and an attempt to postpone the matter, the church approved their request. A few months later, the church's pastor, Thomas Skinner, reported to the church that the black members sought permission to have their own pastor, quote, a colored man sent out by the Society of Colored Brethren in the North, unquote. The church, not wishing to act too hastily on the matter, or perhaps rebuffed by the idea of a black minister from the North, unquote, coming to their church, deferred the matter until later, when it was indefinitely postponed. But the year 1868 represents the turning point in the relationship between the white and black members. Led by a man named Henry Jett, on the 5th of June of 1868, a delegation of black members presented themselves at the door of the church. They were duly received, whereupon Jett expressed the thanks of the church, the colored brethren, for some favors received from us, and having made some remarks as to their condition and hopes, stated that the colored church wished our church to dismiss them in a body. The record further explains that they had already organized in a separate body under the name of the First Baptist Church. The church approved their request and formalized the break. Additional sources indicate that the First Baptist Church was comprised of some 200 members. Trustees included such names as Friday Jones, Richard and James Shepherd, Isaac Vass, and Calvin Strickland. The first pastor of the church, interestingly, was Reverend William Warwick from Philadelphia. The first location for the church building was on North Salisbury Street between North and Johnson Streets. In 1896, they purchased the property originally inhabited by their mother church on the corner of Wilmington and Morgan Street, which is just where we're going to be meeting tomorrow night, diagonally across the Capitol grounds, Capitol Square. In 1904, the First Colored Baptist Church began to erect a new building on the property that was completed in 1909. The church continues to inhabit the building today and is now called the First Baptist Church, Wilmington Street. As might be expected during much of the 20th century, there was little contact between the two sister congregations. They worshiped each Sunday morning at 11 a.m. diagonally across Union Square from one another. In 1959, Charles W. Ward became the pastor of the First Baptist Church, Wilmington Street, beginning a remarkable tenure that lasted until 1987. In 1960, John M. Lewis became pastor of the First Baptist Church, Salisbury Street, this church, where he remained also until 1987, the longest pastoral tenure in the history of the Salisbury Street congregation. These two men became close friends with one another, defying the Jim Crow culture, and this friendship served to bring the two congregations back into closer harmony with one another. On the 8th of March in 2012, both congregations gathered in the rotunda of the state capitol across the street for a 200th anniversary birthday party. After brief remarks by both pastors, the combined congregations sang several hymns in celebration of their shared heritage, which began exactly 200 years earlier on that very spot. The second thing I want to talk about is the role of women in the First Baptist Church of Raleigh. Although the 19th century was still a man's world, the long struggle for women's rights in the nation had its roots in that century. A similar trajectory can be followed at the First Baptist Church of Raleigh. While women were appointed to serve on committees within the church since its earliest days, they seem to have been excluded from the regular decisions of the congregation in the monthly church conference meetings. For example, on the 31st of December, 1869, interesting through the 19th century, they had church conference meetings on New Year's Day, and several that were even held on Christmas Day. If they had a worship service on Christmas Day and it was time for church conference, they had church conference. And it's interesting to see kind of the changes from one century to the other. For example, on the 31st of December, 1869, J.M. Heck, who was Fanny's father and an important leader in the church in the post-Civil War years, moved that the female members be invited to attend a called meeting to discuss the issue of pew rental. That the women had to be invited indicates that they were regularly excluded. Women began to move into leadership positions in the church following the Civil War. In 1867, the church appointed its first deaconesses, Sally Tolis and Roxana Dodd, specifically for the purpose of visiting the sick, quote, where the company of ladies was more suitable, and to collect the apportionments of the ladies with privilege of calling upon the sisters for assistance, unquote. No ordination service was held for these two women, and their status as deaconesses did not carry the same authority as the male deacons. It seems that their purpose was, one, to visit female church members in situations where a male visit may not have been deemed appropriate, and two, to collect financial pledges from female church members, most likely who were either single or widowed. In 1874, the pastor at the time, Thomas H. Pritchard, announced that he was going to insist that the church elect deaconesses at the next regular church conference. The following month, a motion came before the body that called for the election of 4 deaconesses. The motion passed by a vote of 27-4. Sally Tullis, one of the first 2 deaconesses elected in 1867, Mrs. A.M. Lewis, Virginia B. Swepson, and Anna Justice were elected. The most prominent of these 4 women was Virginia Swepson. Virginia Swepson was the daughter of prominent North Carolina politician Bartlett Yancey. She was the wife of the notorious scalawag George W. Swepson, who came to Raleigh following the Civil War, speculating in a variety of business interests. George Swepson was baptized into the membership of the church in 1881 and seemingly became a committed member of the church until his death 2 years later. Historian William S. Powell described him as, quote, one of the chief scalawags of the Reconstruction period, unquote, who was involved in banking, railroad speculation, distribution of liquor, manufacturing, as well as some other business interests. Because of Swepson's shady business dealings, Powell went so far as to characterize him as one of the greatest rascals in North Carolina history. Despite her husband's shady reputation as a scalawag, Virginia, however, was a devoted member of the Raleigh Baptist Church, whose generosity to the church included land, as well as $1,000 to the Woman's Missionary Society upon her death in 1901. The last quarter of the 19th century was the era when the women of the church moved into greater positions of influence within the congregation. That is due in large part to the organization of the Woman's Missionary Society. In 1876, the church records report, quote, "We deem it worthy of special mention that the sisters of our church are accomplishing much for the cause of the Master by their special organizations. They have a missionary society, a sewing society, and a mite society. And some of them propose, with the help of our pastor, to attempt the better organization of the women of North Carolina in working for Jesus," unquote. In 1883, the women of the church brought those 3 societies under the aegis of a new organization with a constitution called the Working Women's Society. The purpose of the new organization was to raise funds for state missions, foreign missions, the poor of the church, or any special work the society may decide upon. Ann Skinner, the wife of the pastor at the time, Thomas Skinner, served as the first president of the group. The records of the society reveal an active organization of devoted women, aggressively dedicated to mission education and caring for the poor of the city. Their confidence and sense of importance is reflected in the Society's minutes as early as January 1884. Mrs. James Briggs, chair of the group's Committee on the Poor, gave a report that on the evening of the Sunday school Christmas festivities, the women collected $28, which had been turned over to the deacons to be distributed to the poor. The record then reports, quote, "The deacons, either wanting to get free from this work or else acknowledging the superior judgment and ability of the ladies to expend this money properly, turn the amount over to the ladies of our society to have the whole matter entirely in our hands," unquote. The entry continues that Mrs. Dodd and Mrs. James Briggs were selected to carry out the task, and, quote, "It is sufficient to say that the work was well done, and thanks came up from every direction for the relief and comfort given to those in need during Christmas week." In 1886, the Working Women's Society was restructured into a new organization called the Women's Missionary Society. According to the Constitution, the purpose of the society was to raise funds for the poor of the church and for missions. The money raised was to be divided into thirds, with 1/3 devoted to the poor, 1/3 devoted to foreign missions, and 1/3 divided equally between home and state missions. Membership in the society required a 10-cent per month contribution. The first officers elected were Mrs. R.G. Lewis, president, Mrs. J.M. Heck, Fanny's mother, as vice president, Mrs. T.H. Briggs, second vice president, Mrs. M.J. Norris, secretary, and Mrs. M.C. Williams as treasurer. Such were the beginnings of the organization that later became identified as Women's Missionary Union, which to the present is regarded as an integral aspect of the overall ministry of the First Baptist Church Raleigh. The minutes of the Women's Missionary Society provide a monthly chronicle of individuals in the church who were in need and the specific aid that was given to them. These records reveal that the women who served were compassionate and highly dedicated to caring for the poor of the church and the city and promoting the cause of Baptist missions both at home and abroad. For example, on 2 May 1887, the minutes provide a detailed report of several poor families and individuals who received help from the Women's Missionary Society. One member suggested that the society ask the physicians who were members of the church if they would be willing to divide those families among themselves and visit them gratuitously whenever there was sickness in the family. The following month, it was reported that the physicians had, quote, cheerfully agreed, unquote, to visit the poor when they were sick. Two of the most prominent names among the records of the Women's Missionary Society are Miss Fanny Heck and Mrs. W.N. Jones, also known as Sally Bailey Jones. Both women's names appear in almost every entry during the last decade of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th. Their work on behalf of the poor of the city is evident, but also revealed is their involvement in mission education. In June 1892, the society honored Fanny Heck with a reception celebrating her election as president of the Women's Missionary Union of the Southern Baptist Convention. Also honored that day was Mrs. James Briggs, who had been elected as vice president of the North Carolina Women's Missionary Union. Missions education and promotion became the primary means of empowerment for the women of First Baptist Church. The monthly meeting of the Women's Missionary Society at the church and the topics studied by the women who participated present the modern interpreter with an opportunity to understand the thinking of the women of First Baptist Church in the early decades of the 20th century. Those women desired to be engaged with the current events of their day. Many of them were leaders in Raleigh's society circles and were quite influential. That influence was apparent in the congregation as they became more empowered in the decision-making process of the church. No one spoke more eloquently about that than did Sally Bailey Jones at a monthly meeting of the society in 1916. Her topic was titled Women in the Christian Religion. This is 1916. The secretary provided the following summary of her presentation. Quote, "Woman was created man's equal, and a high standard for womanhood was given in the Old Testament. Miriam, the sister of Moses, who led her people, was as divinely appointed as Moses. And Deborah, the prophetess, was the first woman to rule a nation by divine appointment. With the coming of Christ, there came a higher life for women, and the gospel of a risen Christ was first heard by the disciples from Mary Magdalene. In later years, the wives of the pioneer preachers made heroic sacrifices in the name of religion, and the Christian home a great force for good. It was 1916. Jones concluded by describing Elizabeth Fry, a Quaker preacher, quote, who did such splendid prison reform, and Mary Lyon, whose efforts for the education of women were so untiring. She spoke of the first missionary society in America and the work of Anne Hasseltine Judson, a splendid example of the heroic work of women, unquote. The story of Susan Hatch, however, serves as an example of the dedication of the women of First Baptist Church and their dedication to the Women's Missionary Society. A long time, and by the way, I keep referring to it as the Women's Missionary Society because that's what the record books refer to it as from that time. A long-time member of the society and supporter, Hatch died in the spring of 1920. At the meeting of the society on the 12th of April 1920, Mrs. Thomas H. Briggs delivered a memorial tribute to her life and dedication. In the tribute, she recalled that Hatch had outlived all of her family. Quote, "What would Mrs. Susan's life have been without her church?" she asked. She continued by comparing Hatch to the widow in the Gospels who gave the widow's mite, indicating that Hatch did not have very much in the way of worldly goods. Her joy was that she had something more to give to her church whenever she was able to make a little bit of money. "She came nearer giving the widow's mite than anyone I know," said Briggs. The following month, the Society's records note that Hatch left her entire estate to the organization, a total of $32.80. The women were so moved by Hatch's dedication to their organization that they voted to purchase a tombstone for her grave in Oakwood Cemetery, and the cost of the tombstone was $40. The men of the church soon recognized the strength and wisdom of the women, and that recognition led to a recommendation by the diaconate in 1925 to add 12 deaconesses. Different from the role of the 4 deaconesses mentioned above, or the 2 deaconesses mentioned above that, the women selected in 1925 were given a presence on the diaconate and for the first time became involved in the decision-making processes. According to the recommendation, the Women's Missionary Society nominated the 12 women. Unfortunately, the deaconesses did not participate in an ordination service like the male deacons. The records from the meeting of the diaconate on 9 June 1925 state the following: "It is with pleasure that we record the presence of the recently elected deaconesses at this, the first meeting since their election." The first mention of an ordination service that included women occurred at a deacons meeting on the 6th of June in 1936, when the pastor suggested setting aside a Wednesday evening for ordaining newly elected deacons and deaconesses. Unfortunately, there's no record of that actual service, just that it was to occur. The women deacons, as early as 1925, may have been involved in an ordination service of some type. There's just no mention of it in the records until 1936. In the years following World War II, the women deserved special recognition, not because they were necessarily more active than other organizations in the church, but because of the nature of their work. Their attention given to the issue of race, years before the beginning of the Civil Rights Movement, is noteworthy. As early as February in 1943, a program topic was titled "Witnessing for Christ Across Barriers of Race." The speaker that day emphasized that there was no race distinction in the heart of God when He created and sent His Son for man's salvation, so there must be none in our dealings with other races. Foy Valentine, in his study of Southern Baptist and race relations in the first half of the 20th century, found that during the 1940s, Southern Baptists showed a remarkably broad and progressive interest in the improvement of race relations. Beginning in 1941, the National WMU set aside $10,000 for the purpose of encouraging closer cooperation with African American Baptist women in the promotion of missions. In the summer of 1940, the National WMU promoted several interracial institutes throughout the South: Jackson, Mississippi, Macon, Georgia, Montgomery, Alabama, for the purpose of fostering mutual support and cooperation between white and black women. The idea caught on in North Carolina the following summer as the first Negro Institute was held at Shaw University in Raleigh. Originally conceived to be a yearly event, the women were unable to meet in 1942, but the institutes resumed in 1943 and continued into the 1950s. The records of the Women's Missionary Society and the First Baptist Church indicate strong support for the interracial institutes. That was due in large part to the leadership of Foy Farmer, who served as the president of the North Carolina Women's Missionary Union from 1942 to 1945, and then from 1946 to 1951. From May of 1945 to March of 46, she also served as the interim and corresponding executive secretary, and she was a member of this church. In the summer of 1947, both the Social Service Commission and the Committee on Race Relations presented reports at the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention that were unanimously approved by the messengers. These two reports set forth 8 principles of conduct that encouraged all Southern Baptists to work toward racial reconciliation. The women from First Baptist Church at the November meeting of 1947, at the November 1947 meeting of the Women's Missionary Society, pledged support of those 8 principles. At their meeting that month, Mrs. Albert Haskins Jr. presented a program titled Racial Discrimination. She encouraged the women to undertake to live up to the 8 points on the program outlined by the SBC. She then presented the following principles to the women of the church and urged them to pray guidance in racial problems. Number 1, to consider the Negro as a real person. To strive to conquer prejudice. To teach our children to conquer prejudice. To protest against injustice to Negroes. To stimulate a deep desire for all Negroes to enjoy privileges as granted in the U.S. Constitution. To be just in dealings with individuals of other races. To strive to promote community goodwill. To help build up Negro churches, Sunday schools, and missions, unquote. Matters related to race continue to be a topic at the Women's Missionary Society meetings of the First Baptist Church throughout the decade of the 1940s. In March of 1949, Miss Lottie Tucker spoke on the topic Misplaced Tensions at the meeting of the Eliza Yates Circle. She told the women assembled that day that, quote, race is no problem with God, to whom all colors are the same, unquote. Another woman identified in the record only as Miss Curran, followed by discussing the tendency many whites had to stereotype all members of other races and nationalities, to judge all by the 1 or 2 we knew or knew of. She urged the women to rise above their prejudices by knowing the members of other races and nationalities. The following year, a guest speaker, Dr. N.C. Newbold, the North Carolina Director of Negro Education at the time, presented a program on, quote, Negro education, unquote, at the general meeting of the church's Women's Missionary Society. He emphasized the fact that Christians have a duty to the Negro, quote unquote, an equal chance in education, to assure the Negro an equal chance in education. The women of First Baptist Church were remarkably progressive in their promotion of racial reconciliation during the post-war years. Interestingly, though, as the Civil Rights Movement began in the 1950s, the records of the church's Women's Missionary Society do not reflect a strong continuation of those attitudes. That does not necessarily reflect a change in attitude, as much as it may suggest that the women believed that the issue of race had become more controversial in society, and their best approach was to promote reconciliation in a quieter manner. In 1998, the Southern Baptist Convention amended its Baptist Faith and Message by adding an article titled The Family. The new article evoked a firestorm of opposition from moderate ranks because it contained a statement that said, quote, and you all know this, "A wife is to submit herself graciously to the servant leadership of her husband, even as the church willingly submits to the headship of Christ. She, being in the image of God, as is her husband, and thus equal to him, has the God-given responsibility to respect her husband and to serve as his helper in managing the household and nurturing the next generation." The newly added article also contained a statement, "Children from the moment of conception are a blessing and heritage from the Lord," an obvious allusion to the abortion debate. Upon his return from the annual meeting of the Southern Baptist Convention that year, the church's pastor, Dan Day, expressed his consternation with the addition of the article, particularly in light of the fact that the First Baptist Church had women in all levels of leadership in the church, including the deacons and church staff. That conversation, which began in a meeting of the diaconate in June of 1998, culminated with a recommendation from the church's Denominational Relations Committee 4 months later to sever all ties between the church and the Southern Baptist Convention. The historic meeting, which occurred on the 23rd of September of 1998, was moderated by the chair of the diaconate, Mrs. Carolyn Dickens. The resolution to sever ties with the convention was presented by Mary John Roach, the chair of the Denominational Relations Committee. The women of First Baptist Church had taken their rightful place of leadership among the men in this historic congregation. An important event happened in 2006, which serves as a good epilogue to this presentation and serves to tie these two streams I have followed through the church's history together. That year, a member of the church, Ebele Achanu, who immigrated from Nigeria and settled in Raleigh, was elected by the congregation to serve as a deacon. She became the first black church member to be elected a member of the diaconate.
Glenn, as you've done the research of the congregation, you noted the multiplication of congregations between the white and the black congregations at the Civil War. How many other congregations have been fostered out of this congregation?
That's a great question. I'd have to look back through the book, count them. It's at least 5 or 6. It's at least 5 or 6 that the church directly birthed. There was a period of time in the late 1800s where the church worked in cooperation with the Raleigh Baptist Association and began some of the churches around the city. But I think, again, I'd have to look back at what I did, but it would be at least 5 or 6 that this congregation directly birthed. And this was, of course, the very first Baptist church in the city, so it is truly the mother church of the Baptist churches in the city. Good question.
Did you say why they were put out of the other church? You did, I forgot. Right at the beginning. Did you say why this group was put out of that other church?
The African American members, they weren't really put out. In the years running up to the Civil War, to be honest with you, I never really could nail down. It seemed to me that there were times where the congregation worshiped together with both white and black members, and then there were other times where the black members were not a part of the white worship, and they were having their own Sabbath afternoon services and things like that. In 1865, following the Civil War, they wanted to begin their own Sunday school. The African American members wanted to begin their own Sunday school, and it was, from the best that I could tell from the records, it was a request that came from their organization. You know, they were organizing themselves, and they were granted, allowed to do that. And then 3 years later, they had already constituted themselves that's when they presented themselves, I think probably to the front door of the church in a ceremonial kind of moment, and requested that they be dismissed to form their own congregation. So they were not put out. That's not the way it should be seen. It was the times following the Civil War,
Yeah, but I didn't ask this very well. I'm thinking about the charter.
The Church 23.
You said they came out of another congregation.
Oh, I'm sorry. I think the original records, the earliest records, say that this original 23, 14 of African descent, 9 of Caucasian descent, Anglo descent, came from a church called the Cool Spring Baptist Church, and it was located somewhere outside of Raleigh. And I could not find anything about the Cool Spring Baptist Church. That was a road that would lead me down, and I had other roads I needed to go down, and that's something that I put a bookmark by, and maybe we'll do sometime. But it was presumably a congregation outside of the city of Raleigh was organized in 1792, I believe, and so the impression I got was these people were traveling outside somewhere to go to church, and to this Cool Spring Baptist Church, and they wanted a more local congregation. So good question.
In light of where this church gathers from a property standpoint, do you have any sense of how many governors over time have worshiped here regularly, or perhaps even been members of First Baptist while they served in office?
2 governors I know of. One was W.W. Holden in the 19th century, who was the only governor in North Carolina history to be impeached. And but there is a long story to that. There is a long story to that, and that we don't have time. But he was impeached, and he was a member here. Eventually left, and I think went to the Episcopal Church. Is that right? He had grown up in either the Methodist or Episcopal tradition. I mentioned him briefly in the book. One more famous governors in my lifetime, Jim Hunt, when he was a student at NC State University, which for those of you that aren't from around here, NC State is just down Hillsborough Street, a few blocks, and you're on the campus of NC State. And I am told that he attended worship here regularly when he was a student at NC State. So those are the 2 governors I know of. Now there have been a number of, 2 or 3 senators, the most famous of which was Jesse Helms, who was a member here until the mid-60s. And so a number of politicians, and obviously as these 2 pastors that are here to tell you, there have probably been a number of funerals in this church that were attended by much of the political folks in the city. It's a very prominently located church. And one of the things that I say at the conclusion of the book that I was particularly impressed with about this church, two things in particular. One, I'm impressed with the fact that it's a 200-year-old congregation, and I could not find any evidence that this church ever fired a pastor. 200 years. There were certain church conference meetings and certain deacons meetings that you could read some tension in the words, in between. Nothing stated explicitly, but there's nothing in the records that say that Brother So-and-so was terminated by the congregation or had any kind of scandal or anything like that. And I think that's remarkable. That just says something remarkable about this church. It speaks to the harmony of its fellowship. There was a major period of turmoil in the church in the 1830s. And I talk about this in the book. It was one of 2 things. Either the anti-mission spirit came into the church and conflicted at the time that the Baptist State Convention in North Carolina was just beginning, and the pastor of the church was Patrick Dowd, who was the first president of the Baptist State Convention. And so there was either some anti-mission stuff coming in there that led to a major split, or I try to make a case in the book that it was the Campbellites that came into the city and came into the church, or got turned on to Campbellism and split off. But in the 1830s, there was a split, and a remnant of the church, led by one of the founding deacons, John Briggs, reconstituted the church. And so I call that period from 1832 to 1840 the silent years, because there are no records from that period of time. And the controversy in the church became so acute that the association was consulted, and the Raleigh Baptist Association became involved. But unfortunately, during the decade of the 1830s, there are about 4 or 5 years of the Raleigh Association minutes that are missing, even from the. Is Vicky still here? Even from the back. I tried finding them there in the Baptist collection at Wake Forest, and they don't exist that I could find anywhere. And one of the really frustrating, there was one particular year where the association, this is in the late 1830s or the mid 1830s, the association appointed a committee to kind of work with the Raleigh Baptist Church, investigate what's going on. They were to bring a report about the situation the following year to the association, and that following year's minutes are missing. And so it's just kind of a big mystery specifically what happened. But there was a big fracture in the church in the 1830s. And that's the only split in the church, the only major fracture in the church in 200 years. They had another controversy that I write about in the book in the 1960s that related to the civil rights movement. But it did not lead to a major break like the 1830s situation did. So this is a church that has had remarkably harmonious fellowship for a 200-year-old Baptist church, longevity of pastoral tenures. And then the second thing that truly impresses me about this church is that it, for all of these years, it has been right in the heart of the North Carolina political government, area, and there's no evidence that it ever tried to selfishly influence state government for its own purposes. It did not try to get the legislature to do it. It has been a good neighbor. That's what I'm trying to say. It's been a good neighbor, a good recognition of, our mission here is to be the people of Christ, and the legislature has its mission, and we're going to be a good neighbor to them, but we're not going to run them, and they're not going to run us. And there's a good sense there that this church has had, and that's very impressive, I think. Anyway, that's probably a little longer answer than you were looking for, but